So today's presentation is part of the Conversations in Forest History webinar series. Our guest today is Chris Bolgiano. She is an environmental historian in Virginia, as I said, at James Madison University. And with that, I'm going to just turn things over to Chris and sit back and enjoy this sedimental journey.
Okay. Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Jamie, and welcome all to this sedimental journey. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about why we should know forest history and what that history means for our future. This is a story about the ultimate result of world forest history, which is to say it's a story about dirt, or rather the loss of it, but also the possibility of reclaiming at least some of it. The two photos here of the Susquehanna River, the largest tributary to the Chesapeake Bay, are linked across a century by cause and consequence. The Chesapeake Bay watershed covers 64,000 square miles across parts of 6 states and the District of Columbia. It's the largest estuary in the US, by some measures, the 3rd largest in the world. And its problems reflect those of many other estuaries, those places where freshwater meets saltwater. That big brown river smothering sediment plume foretells the future for perhaps centuries to come. Soil degradation and loss caused by humans is an ancient global story. Fish bones from roughly 13,000 years ago have been found in what's now the Sahara Desert. And there's an ongoing debate about whether the waters dried up from climate change and or the human change from hunter-gatherers to livestock herders around the same time. About 2,600 years ago, the most famous philosopher in history complained that the formerly rich soil around Athens had been washed away, leaving the mere skeleton of the land. China, after 40 centuries of farming, by the 1900s had what observers called some of the worst soil erosion in the world. 68% of South American soil has been degraded by deforestation and overgrazing, and that's expected to increase. And by the early 1900s, a North Carolina native named William Ashe was writing about massive erosion in the eastern US, where the southeastern Piedmont was becoming the most agriculturally eroded region in the country. But William Ashe was especially concerned about logging on the steep slopes of the Appalachian Mountains from New Hampshire to Georgia. As author Chara Miller wrote in the spring-fall 2020 issue of Forest History Today, published by the Forest History Society, William Ashe was an early voice for restoration and protection of forests around headwater streams. This presentation eventually follows up Chara Miller's article by going downstream with the soil that William Ashe saw washing away. However, I'm going to begin with first causes. I'm not a forester or a biologist, but a retired university librarian who lives in a 100-acre wood in the Allegheny Mountains of Virginia. My back border is the 1.1 million acre George Washington National Forest, largest national forest in the East. For many years, I've trekked through the woods on a forest forensics quest for clues to one of the world's great erosion events. Old fences in the woods usually mean one thing: livestock. Rot-resistant American chestnut rail fences in the earliest years of settlement fenced in gardens and crop fields, allowing livestock to forage freely in surrounding forests, regardless of ownership, congruent with the ancient tradition of the forest commons that European settlers brought with them. By the late 1800s, as Americans and their livestock rapidly increased, counties passed ordinances requiring farmers to fence in their livestock. Barbed wire was patented in the 1870s, and by the 1920s was being nailed to living trees as an estimated 4 billion American chestnut trees died from an imported fungus, a disaster for both people and wildlife. You can still see the telltale straight edge cut of a saw on these lichen-covered stumps, but whittle off a chip and you get a fresh whiff of pine. In 2019, I confirmed with forest history professor Dr. Jim Finley at Penn State that these stumps could date back to the late 1800s, when farmers throughout the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia sought out shortleaf and other yellow pines to replace the many barns and mills burned during the Civil War. Conifers generally tend to decay slowly from the outside in, and the ring of moss around many of the stumps might approximate former size. I just hope the barns have lasted as long as the stumps. Multiple stemmed chestnut oaks like this one, my husband's favorite hunting stand, are abundant throughout the Southern Appalachians. They are clues to one of the biggest industries ever in the woods, tan bark, peeled off the felled tree to leach out tannic acid to tan leather. Before plastics, leather was essential. Chestnut oak bark is second only to eastern hemlock bark for tannic acid. Tanning was an international business, and our local historian, Pat Turner Ritchie, found that in the early 1900s, raw hides from Argentina arrived at the railroad depot in my nearby small town of Broadway, Virginia, to be hauled to local tanneries. Unlike many species, chestnut oaks sprout fairly well from stumps, and a century ago, deer had been hunted out so they didn't browse off the sprouts. Often the naked logs were left lying in the woods, fuel for wildfires. Iron ore was being mined by Jamestown colonists in 1609, and the seams running down the Appalachians were being mined by the 1700s. Ore was smelted by burning charcoal, which burns much hotter than wood. Charcoal was made by smoldering around 30 cords of 4-foot logs built into a mound around the central chimney. Soil was raked up and dumped on the mound to smother flames and keep out oxygen. By the 1850s, hundreds of iron furnaces down the mountain chain ran on charcoal. Depending on size, a furnace would consume 150 to 1,000 acres of woods annually, using all species. After about 30 years, the trees would be cut again, so hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of forested acres were repeatedly cut for charcoal. Coke, made from coal, replaced charcoal around the 1930s, although World War II gave charcoal making a boost on the farm. This is not a modern art sculpture on one of our ridges. It's an apparently home-welded winch to pull logs from the slopes and hollows up to the ridge, where a cart or a truck carried them to a mill or a rail depot. Old roads are prime evidence of work in the woods, and we see traces of them along pretty much every ridge. The trees around the winch are approximately 80 to 130 years old, so this winch took part in the turn of the century logging frenzy that deforested much of what remained in the eastern United States. Accessible forests had been cut over for centuries, but there was still plenty of virgin timber on the upper slopes and ridges of the Appalachians. And what timber it was. The white oak on top, where the men are sitting on the notch before felling, was the biggest tree ever cut in West Virginia, estimated at 1,000 years old. The poplar in the photo below filled an entire train. And it was the coming of trains with shay engines, and especially the narrow gauge dinky railroads that could crawl up almost every hollow, that invited wholesale deforestation. After the Civil War, as southern cities rebuilt and northern cities expanded, timber companies, mostly owned by distant businessmen, operated with what one of the loggers at the time called a cut out and get out attitude. In just 50 years, West Virginia went from being 95% forested to 85% denuded. And that's pretty much what happened across much of the entire Appalachian mountain chain. The equipment of the time was steam powered by wood or coal and threw sparks that ignited slash left across entire mountainsides. The Forest Service report on acreage they purchased right behind my property in the 1930s mentioned severe fires and lack of merchantable timber. A 1940 Forest Service report on the Southern Appalachians describes, and I quote, "In the wake of lumbering operations came forest fires, great roaring conflagrations feeding on the debris left from lumbering, destroying mature timber and young growth as well, sometimes even burning down through the humus and soil to bare rock. We have lots of fire sign on our property. If an old blackened skeleton leaves char on your fingers, it may have been a living tree killed by a hot fire, which renders some trees rot resistant. It's estimated that less than 5% of the pre-European forests survived, mainly in areas too rocky or too wet to log. Historians generally date the worst era of deforestation from 1880 to 1930. Already by the early 1900s, floods were causing millions of dollars in damages, silting up navigable streams, still important then for transportation, and drowning thousands of people, including the Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood in 1889 that drowned 2,200 people, due in part to deforestation above the dam that increased the volume of rainwater that caused the dam to fail. In 1911, Congress passed the Weeks Act, authoring the very young US Forest Service to purchase and repair millions of burning, eroding acres, mostly in mountain ranges. Ironically, the very destruction of the magnificent original forest, the most biodiverse temperate woodlands in the world, led to the purchase of the Eastern National Forests. Today, those national forests form a modern commons, providing enormous ecosystem services to all of society that far exceed the value of timber products, such as clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, hunting and fishing and other recreation, and now, as we've recently recognized, carbon sequestration that helps mitigate the impacts of climate change. But millennia of soil building were lost in a minute, geologically speaking. Millions of tons of ancient soil were swept away, leaving gullies and rock piles like these shown here. So the obvious question is, where did it all go? The not so obvious answer is largely into mill ponds. As Mr. Jefferson noted, mills lined virtually every suitable stream from the 1600s to the early 1900s. This map, constructed by Dr. Dorothy Meritz of Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania from the 1840 census, shows some 65,000 mills. It can be accessed by county and lists my own county of Rockingham as having not just grain, but also sawmills, fulling mills that pounded wool fibers, surprisingly no powder mills to pound charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter into gunpowder, but oil mills that crushed oil-bearing seeds like linseed. What all those mill dams did was stop sediment from moving downstream. But by about the 1920s, most water mills were abandoned and had failed or been removed, some of them already for a century or more. So what happened to the sediments piled behind the failed dams? Well, they started moving downstream, and they're still moving, slow brown ghosts of fertility lost. We tend to think of a legacy as something positive gained from the past, or something good left behind for the future to inherit. Legacy sediment isn't a phrase that trips naturally off the tongue. Of course, there's a natural weathering process, but that's not what legacy sediment is. There are various differently nuanced definitions of legacy sediment, but the EPA definition is pretty basic. Erosion tends to be worst on slopes because gravity rules. And there was erosion even where there were no dams or before any dams went in, and even some Native American farming practices caused erosion. But the pace of soil loss accelerated out of sight after European settlement. Each watershed has its own soil geology and land use history, but in general, legacy sediments are characterized as fine-grained and nutrient-rich, a potentially valuable commodity. But in streams, legacy sediments suffocate the critical bottom habitats. They can carry phosphorus and nitrogen along with them. And excess sediments, phosphorus, and nitrogen are the three main causes of poor ecosystem health in the Chesapeake Bay and many others. Various researchers estimate that legacy sediments contribute anywhere from 6% to 90% of all suspended sediments in many eastern streams. Well, that wide range gives you some idea of the often vigorous debate about how much legacy sediments affect water quality. Smith Creek in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley is a good example of the conundrum of legacy sediments. The creek rises on the west side of Massanutten Mountain and flows through a historically agricultural landscape to larger, higher order streams that eventually flow into the Chesapeake Bay. Smith Creek is just the kind of headwater stream that William Ashe argued should be protected, and it has the history to justify it. This 1912 report on 17,000 acres on Massanutten Mountain was done for the Forest Service before purchase for the George Washington National Forest. 40% of those 17,000 acres drain into Smith Creek. The report states, and I quote, "The exploitation of this tract began many years before the Civil War. The area has been stripped of timber and repeatedly burned, killing most of the young growth. Floods and erosions are unchecked. Slopes and ridges have been left bare. Farmers living near the tract say that during the wet seasons, the streams are much higher and floods are more numerous," end quote. And several students of Professor Scott Eaton at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, near Smith Creek, researched historical records from the mid-1800s on and found a minimum of 15 mill ponds, with sediment deposits at 4 sites ranging from about 3 to 9 feet. Today, the Smith Creek watershed is still dominated by agriculture, but is increasingly ex-urbanized, with brick ramblers sitting next door to 19th century log cabins. After the state of Virginia listed Smith Creek as impaired due to bacteria and sediment in 2004, several landowners started working together to improve the stream. Because of that partnership, in 2010, the USDA Natural Resources and Conservation Service, the NRCS, designated Smith Creek as one of 4 Chesapeake Bay watershed showcases to demonstrate how cooperation can clean up a stream. The partnership now has 20 groups, including government agencies, conservation nonprofits, landowners, and academics. And over the last decade, land use improvements have been made on some 10,000 acres. The list here indicates the conventional voluntary approaches to improving water quality called best management practices, or BMPs. Clearly, fencing cattle out of the stream, using cover crops instead of leaving soil bare, and so on, all are good for water quality because they help keep soil particles in place. And in 2014, parts of one tributary to Smith Creek, Mountain Run, were delisted from impaired status. And yet, Smith Creek water quality overall remains problematic. Hydrologist James Weber of the US Geological Survey said, "It's difficult to clearly link changes on the landscape with in-stream responses." That's basically what graduate student Julia Portman found when she collected and identified 31,000 macroinvertebrates from stream segments at 15 sites along Smith Creek for her master's thesis. The number and abundance of native organisms is the ultimate metric of ecosystem health. The greatest biodiversity Julia found was in segments where improvements had been made 2 to 3 or more decades ago. Proximity of roads, habitat factors like size of cobbles on the stream bottom were important, but time to recover was the best predictor of biodiversity. That's a promising signal that a stream will respond to better land management given time to recover. But in the bigger picture, there's something that literally muddies the gains made. As she trekked along Smith Creek, Julia documented stream banks up to 13.5 feet high. High banks are a defining clue to legacy sediments, and a 2018 study of Smith Creek found that at least 70% of its in-stream sediments come from banks. Trees falling into a creek as erosion washes away the sediments deposited centuries earlier illustrate how a stream that looks natural to our eyes today is really not natural at all. Archaeologists call it the tyranny of the present, because people believe that the landscape they see is the way it's always been, when in reality, it's been massively changed by human use. Sediments wash away not just during high water, but also as winter freezing and thawing sends crumbs of dirt tumbling down the bank. Some legacy sediments may be temporarily trapped as trees fall into creeks and create debris dams, or they may settle in quiet pools or on floodplains or stream banks. One study calculated that sediments can be stored from 1 year to 20,000 years, with a median storage of about a century. In the meantime, runoff from practices that became widespread after World War II, like poultry houses with 50,000 or more birds, chemical fertilizers on crops, and construction from ever-spreading sprawl, send large amounts of sediments, phosphorus, and nitrogen into the bay. It's these sources that Andy Miller, immediate past chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Committee to the Chesapeake Bay program, points to as the bay's main problems. While legacy sediments in unstable banks can degrade smaller upland streams, he said, those older sediments from historic deforestation are unlikely to have as many nutrients. But a revolutionary new approach to stream restoration is showing how much legacy sediments can degrade upland streams and how much removing them can improve water quality. Research by Dorothy Meritz and colleagues at Franklin and Marshall College has found that before European settlement, smaller, lower order streams in valley bottoms were lined with connected systems of low wetlands that acted like sponges, shown on the right. Beavers, especially in the Northeast and Great Lakes region, probably contributed to this landscape with their low, permeable dams. Plants could grow roots through shallow floodplains down to groundwater level, anchoring the soils during floods. Floodwater could spread out into sheet flows, reducing its force and damage. And the most amazing confirmation of this ecovision comes from the thin black line. Oh, there we go. Of original wetland soil lying below the legacy sediment. It's thin because there was relatively little sediment washing off the land, and black because it's nearly entirely organic matter in stages of decay. Often that soil still contains viable seeds of the pre-settlement wetlands. Dr. Meritz and her colleagues believe this is how streams sustain themselves for, say, the last 10 to 15,000 years since the glaciers retreated. So they developed the idea of removing legacy sediments and allowing a truly natural stream to reassert itself. And because Joe Sweeney saw trees dying that he planted along stream banks on his farm to stop erosion, he decided to use his farm as a test case. Joe happens to be the director of the Water Science Institute, a nonprofit environmental consulting firm in Pennsylvania. It took several years of collecting data, but in 2011, the Pennsylvania environmental contracting firm Land Studies hauled away almost 23,000 tons of soil. They planted native species found in that thin black line and used biodegradable erosion control mats to get the plants established. Within 2 years, the plant community came back, as Joe Sweeney put it, like a chia pet. The temperature of the water dropped 8 to 15 degrees, and the wetland plants attracted pollinators, amphibians, birds, and mammals. Now, after more than 10 years of monitoring, sediment loads are dramatically reduced, while groundwater absorption increased. Phosphorus and nitrogen were also reduced, but because those nutrients take various complex chemical forms, the legacy sediment debate includes questions about whether they are biologically available for plants to use, because if not, they don't contribute to algae blooms and other problems. But there's no question that the carbon sequestration tripled to 7,000 pounds, noteworthy in this era of global warming. All this on less than 5 acres of new wetlands. That's the kind of results that the land studies crew is getting from dozens of stream restorations they have done and are doing in Pennsylvania and Maryland. The upfront costs are high, given all the heavy equipment needed. Funds come from state and federal grants, as well as landowner cost share contributions and donations from nonprofits. Joe Sweeney says that legacy sediment removal is highly competitive on a per pound pollution reduction basis to conventional BMPs. And Corey Gilliams, the NRCS District Conservation in Harrisonburg, pointed out that many traditional BMPs take chronic maintenance, like livestock fencing swept away by floods or rotational grazing. Trees planted on stream banks that are deeper than about 4 feet may not be able to send roots down to groundwater before a drought. Corey gives BMPs a lifespan of 10 to 15 years, subject to available funding and landowner commitments, and any improvements show up slowly. In comparison, a natural flood-resistant stream could last twice that long without much maintenance, and perhaps much longer, depending, of course, on what happens upstream. And as Big Spring Run shows, improvements are dramatic within just a couple of years. A new approach is to fly a lidar-equipped drone, as the Water Science Institute staff did at Smith Creek last year, to send a laser of light to measure distances and show where stream banks are highest and mitigation could do the most good. But where did all those thousands of tons of rich, ancient soils go? What is the final destination of this sedimental journey? Jimmy Kreider, Director of Field Operations for Land Studies, told me that the legacy sediments from Rife Run shown here were spread on adjacent sports fields and seeded to make the fields less prone to flooding, as the aerial view shows. It's expensive to screen and haul so much soil, so he tries to stay close to the restoration site. He spread it on a cornfield, which produced high yields the following year. It's been used in parks for trails, on golf courses to build up driving ranges and fairways, by neighbors for landscaping, and by farmers to fill low spots in fields. It's even been sold to topsoil brokers. These uses at least somewhat honor these ancient soils, but it's also been used for construction fill and as a daily cover of dirt at a landfill. The land studies crew removes a lot of legacy sediments, 3,500 truckloads in a typical year, and sometimes twice that much. I have a pipe dream of urban gardens with fresh vegetables and food deserts, but as of now, the end of the sedimental journey is on soccer fields and construction sites. But that is most definitely not the end of the story. Because we know now, if we didn't then, that soil is a highly complex living system full of what the late great biologist Dr. E.O. Wilson called the little things that run the world, like the mycorrhizal fungi that weave webs around plant roots to exchange nutrients, and without which trees and many other plants simply will not thrive. Soil that developed over millennia grew these virgin spruce in West Virginia that dwarfed the loggers that cut them. To show you how much damage the severe loss of soil can do, consider these monoculture ferns and spindly trees that are all that will grow in that same area more than a century after it was logged, burned, and grazed. A 1943 Forest Service report on the conditions in the Virginia mountains near the West Virginia border stated, I quote, "Much of the vegetative cover is inadequate for the control of excessive runoff. In some locations, better sites because of fire or other past abuses are of low productivity," end quote. Decades of regrowth like this now obscure the reduced fertility from soil loss. And I've heard people say, oh, how beautiful the ferny glen. It's dangerous not to know what we've lost, because then we'll never know what to reclaim. But it's not only the forest's future fertility that we've lost. Trees are the best carbon capture technology yet discovered. Through photosynthesis, Forests take carbon dioxide out of the air and use it to build wood and leaves. Then as leaves, branches, and whole trees die, fall, and decay, they are rebuilding soil while complex carbon molecules seep down into it. Forest soil is the largest reservoir of carbon on land, even though incalculable amounts were lost during the deforestation. Our recovering forests today already take a substantial amount of carbon emissions out of the air every year. And most of that carbon is stored in eastern forests because deciduous trees tend to ingest more carbon dioxide than western conifers. Forests are well documented by scientists as an essential defense against climate change, and in particular, aging and old forests, which continue to sequester carbon for the many centuries that trees can live. Our recovering, maturing forests, especially our national forests, could protect our future if we can protect them. Old forests and young wetlands. Is the past trying to tell us something? As William Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Certainly legacy sediments are still very much in the passing stage. Then there's the famous quote from the philosopher George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Singer Brittany Howard of the band Alabama Shakes put it more concisely when she recently rapped, "History repeats, we defeat ourselves." But my favorite line about time is a lyric from a Steve Miller Band song from the 1970s. Time keeps on slipping, slipping, slipping into the future. And obviously so do our legacies. Thanks for joining me on this sedimental journey, and I'll try to answer any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, as she said, please submit your questions through the Q&A format. Well, that was a lot to digest. And one of the things that came to mind, of course, is the almost, if you will, the entry bar to restoration, i.e. the upfront costs. Can you elaborate a little bit on sources of funding for that?
Oh gosh, there's an alphabet soup of federal, EPA, and state grants. Yes, I have a sheet here somewhere that lists the National Water Quality Initiative, innovation in conservation. That's a large part of it. There's also landowner cost share, like for fencing, cattle out of the stream. The farmer will do the whole job and then submit bills for reimbursement, anywhere from 50 to 95%. It just depends on the program, on the particular task to be done. Some of the conservation nonprofits, for example, the Valley Conservation Council in Stanton, paid the legal fees for conservation easements for some farmers along Smith Creek to do conservation easements on their properties. So it's just a whole a bowl of different possibilities.
Okay, so I think in short, or in sum, if you're a landowner, there are many possible sources of funding to help out if you're looking to pursue this.
Yes.
It's just going to vary depending on location, probably amount of land we're talking about, maybe condition, those sorts of things.
Yes, there's a lot of parameters. Landowners that are interested should contact certainly their state environmental agency, also the local USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service office. Shouldn't be too hard really to track down.
Okay, thanks for that tip. So boy, as soon as I posed that question, our audience it just populated the Q&A section, which is fantastic. So we'll just start with Andrea and Evan, who want to ask, how do you cope with the depressing aspects of this history of loss?
Yes, that's a good question. And it's difficult. It's difficult. However, just walking through my woods today and seeing that there is wildlife there. There are birds moving through. It's migration season. Just trying to take comfort and joy from what is there now. And we have a conservation easement on our property. I take some comfort in the hope that it might protect it from future abuse, like what happened in the past. But it is difficult. I mean, it is difficult. I no longer watch TV programs on nature, even though, you know, the beautiful wildlife and so on, but I know that right outside the frame, there's all these problems, all these threats. So I can't even watch nature documentaries anymore. It's all I can do to read Sierra magazine or, you know.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues as a environmental historian I face is that, you know, we deal with the declensionist approach to, you know, it's everything degrades, or, you know, there's always, it's this gloom and doom, or doom and gloom approach to history. And I think really what it's forced historians to do is look beyond that model to see what it's easy to lapse into that, but it's not everything has a sad ending. Mm-hmm. And some of it is just drawing, as you were saying, you know, you're walking in the woods, and so that's an inspiration to keep you going. So it kind of harkens back to the whole get out into nature. Nature, you know, it's been demonstrated through scientific tests and the like, that the connecting with nature has its healing properties for humans.
Yes.
So frankly, if you're feeling, Andrea and Evan, if you're feeling sad, do your best to get out in the woods, breathe that air, get inspired, and then get back to work. That would be my my advice. Adam Downing, who I believe is at Virginia Tech, asks, what has been your most delightful and surprising discovery as you've done research for this story?
Oh gosh, most delightful. Well, my first book was about mountain lions, cougars. And I guess just learning that they lived here, that they might have been on my property and hunted. Also learning about the Native Americans, that I don't think they lived on my property because I'm on kind of a mountainside, but it's certainly in the Shenandoah Valley. That has been really interesting, and how they use the land, you know, the slash and burn, which has gotten kind of a bad reputation, I think, from South America. But actually, if you slash and burn and then leave it for at least 20 to 30 years, it will regrow quite nicely, and it's a relatively sustainable way to go about things. So, you know, learning about those past practices and the past wildlife. I don't get reports on cougars anymore. For years, I used to. I don't get them so much anymore, but I am part of a group that looks to bring them back eventually. So those kinds of things are, you know, hopeful as well as giving you joy, you know.
Yeah, I think the analog would be out in Montana and Idaho Panhandle with rehabbing the land so it becomes reviving the grizzly habitat.
Yes.
And I'm sure there are examples all around the country, but that's what springs to mind there, because I knew somebody who was doing exactly that. His belief was generally, if the grizzly is here, then the land is doing well. It was his bellwether.
Excellent. Yes.
I think along the lines of that question, Lars asks, well, first of all, he says this was a super presentation.
Oh, thanks.
So, but he says, you seem to be viewing the past through today's eyes. What would you have advised people to do had you been there 150 years ago? Oh
gosh, you know, that's just so hard, because everyone is a product of their time, you know, to a certain point. It's hard for me to imagine ever watching topsoil being carried away in a flood from a field and not thinking, oh, that can't be right. But again, I'm using modern knowledge. So I just think that's impossible to say. I guess there is an analogy, though, I think, maybe with slavery. Even in the 1700s, people were saying, no, slavery is not right. It is wrong. There were always people from the very beginning who said that, even though it became embedded in American life and certainly in the life of the South. So it's just very difficult to say.
Well, George Perkins Marsh, 1864, publishes his book that is still in print today. And he was warning about these things, and he drew on the history of the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world. So this is not a new problem.
No.
And he made recommendations, some of which ultimately the federal government acted on, creating a forest service, taking land out of use, or at least managing it, whether you're talking about national forests or national parks. He offered up several possible solutions. It just took a half century longer or more before those were acted upon. And that's the thing, is we have to look backwards, and this is why we wanted you here today. We have to look back to understand what we were doing, to then understand what we can do today, and then project forward and do so with hope and optimism that we can mitigate the damage. But yeah, this is, Marsh's book was not a bestseller. It got into the hands of influential people, but I think you or I 150 years ago, standing beside Marsh, would have been dismissed as well. Nope, progress is plowing the land and cutting the forest.
Yes, and in those days, people thought we'd never come to the end of it. People thought there was always more. Now we know.
Yeah. Matt Williams asks, what is the current status of stream restoration banking? We did talk about mitigating some of the costs for landowners, and I guess this is for me, but as much also for you. Do we see this discussion about, I guess, stream restoration banking as a possible future topic? We'll set that aside. Do you know anything about the current status of restoration banking, or is that outside of your area of study?
Is that does that refer to mitigation banking, where a piece of land is developed one place, but another piece of land is set aside to compensate for that? That's the only kind of banking I'm familiar with.
I'll ask Matt if you would follow up, answer Chris's question with a follow-up question, and we'll come back to that. Paul Clements says, or asks, are there inventories of sediments in the Chesapeake Bay that can be related to the material you've considered?
Yes, I've asked that question too, and I've asked about depths of sediment and so on, and I haven't really got a very clear answer. I can refer the questioner to Andy Miller, who's at the Baltimore campus of University of Maryland, I believe. And contact me and I'll give you his email. But I mean, that's a good question, and I wondered too. And I don't know that there's a clear answer to that.
Okay.
But welcome to email me. I can put my email back up, or
I'll have that in the follow-up email along with a link to this video so people can watch it and share it.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you for being willing to do that.
Sure.
Dan Richter I'm going to just share the comment. First of all, he says, well done, Chris.
Thank you.
He says, soil scientists are literally just realizing how most floodplain soils in the East are inundated with upland eroded soil. Great observation, Dan. Diane Lepkowski wants to know, do you know of any small swaths of old growth forests in Virginia or in nearby states? I know in North Carolina, we have the Joyce Kilmer
Yes.
in Southwest North Carolina. What's up your way?
Well, Shenandoah National Park has a small section. Let's see, is it White Oak Canyon? I know, Diane, and I can tell you, but there's a small section in Shenandoah National Park. There's actually a book, Old Growth in the East. I believe it's online. There's a few small sections in West Virginia that I can tell Diane. I don't have it right on the tip of my brain here, but yes, there are small. Pennsylvania has several small, relatively small sections. So you can go and visit old growth. There's a cathedral forest in West Virginia that's fairly well known, but I found that it was so small at edge effect, the light comes in, the undergrowth was nothing like old growth. So, you need a certain amount of acreage to keep out that edge effect and have some integrity to the understory. But there are, some places that have acreage that you do get a sense of the absolute majesty of it.
Well, so this is Karen Bennett wants to know how you got interested in this topic and how you learned about it. She wants to know a little bit more about your background. How did you go from being a librarian at James Madison University to an environmental historian with several books and many articles under your belt?
Okay, I'll confess, I'm a back to the lander. When I got the job at what was then Madison College in 1974, we moved to the Shenandoah Valley and we wanted to buy some land. We wanted to move out of cities. We wanted to go back to the land. We wanted to have a garden. And we looked for years before we found where we live now. And the fact that it bordered the George Washington National Forest was phenomenal. And once we settled there, I started looking around, and I was a history major. Wanting to know the history of something is absolutely fundamental for me. So I started reading the history of the area, and we would have friends come and we'd walk through the woods and they'd say, "Oh, what a beautiful virgin forest." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, no. Yeah, this is not virgin forest by any means. And so I guess I just felt the impulse to start writing about it and tell people how bad it was so that hopefully it would never get that bad again. I do hope we can learn from history. That's very problematic, I know. But that's what got me into it, was just moving into a forest and learning about it.
Okay. I guess following up on that, just it's a comment from Chuck Nicholson who says, regarding old growth forests, President Biden recently ordered federal agencies to inventory their old growth forests and take measures to protect them. So that I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
Matt Williams has followed up, and he says, credits are provided for development projects for stream restoration. It's similar to wetland mitigation banking, but specific to streams.
Yeah, I've not, none of the people I interviewed mentioned that. I've not run into that, particularly with stream restoration in this area. Or with the people I interviewed. So I'm sorry, I can't address that.
That's okay. And I'd like to thank Dudley Hartel for providing the link in the Q&A for, excuse me, oldgrowthforest.net/network-forests. So that's, you can find that link in the Q&A format, or quite simply, Google old growth forests near me, and see what turns up.
Can I go back to the Biden?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, that concerns me a little bit. I mean, it's a good step, of course, but as we've seen, there's very few old growth forests in the East. Now, what we have are millions of acres. Just in the Appalachian chain alone, there's some 6 million acres of maturing forests, a century, more or less. Of course, there's been logging since then, but in general, those maturing forests, they're nowhere near old growth yet. If the oldest would be 100 to 130 years, but they have tremendous potential for carbon sequestration, as well as clean air, clean water, biodiversity. One of the questions that came up with regard to Biden's executive order was, how do you define maturing forest? So I wrote my little comment. I would define a maturing forest as one that can reproduce. In other words, oaks, white oaks get to be 40 to 60 years old or so before they produce a lot of acorns. So to me, that's a mature tree if it can reproduce. My husband says that's an adolescent tree, but nonetheless. I hope that the definitions are not going to be too exclusive, because we need, in this case, to be inclusive, I feel.
Okay. Tom Giroux asked, how do we balance the desire to remove old mill dams to open up waterways for aquatic life versus their benefits of containing those old legacy sediments? Which environmental improvement would take priority?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And there have been some problems with the contemporary removal of dams and then the flood of sediments that come down. I don't know that there's an answer really to that. I don't know that there's an answer. It's something that has to be anticipated if you're going to take a dam down. Sometimes, they put fish ladders, so that fish can get over the dam. Mm-hmm. That might be one answer. But really, it's a problem that is very difficult to resolve.
Well, because it's an issue, public and private interests, because the dam may sit on private land, but there are downstream implications for removing the dam.
Yes.
Let's say it's upstream from public land, there's just so many stakeholders involved. I would hope that there is open and public dialogue about this, and so it's somebody's going to go away happy. Somebody's not going to be happy, or maybe nobody's happy in the end. But it's a tough. It's the challenge of any restoration work is how do we make what is best, and who is it best for? Is it best for the land, best for animal or wildlife habitat, or is it about humans? And so there's that balance. So Ernie Reed says, might legacy sediments be used on previously forested lands and clear cuts that otherwise give rise to accelerated erosion? Might it minimize transportation of soils and revitalize the very lands degraded by extensive commercial logging?
Oh, that's a great question. And I've thought about that quite a bit. A clear cut area, it would be great if you could drop legacy sediment from the air and then seed it, in some way. But Jimmy Kreider of the Land Studies group that does these restorations, that actually hauls away the soil, it's very expensive to haul it away. As I mentioned, he tries to use the legacy sediment as close as possible to where he's dug it up, because he screens it for rocks and so on, and then hauls it. And the expense is fairly prohibitive from what I understand, taking it any distance. Now, depending on funding and commitment of society to restoring abused places, maybe in the future we'll be willing to spend that money. But at this point, I would love to see just the legacy sediments taken into cities and made into gardens. But he says that he has so much of it that we'd have to have an awful lot of gardens. Well, I don't really see a problem with that, but so far it hasn't happened. So, but yeah, Ernie, that's a great suggestion. I would love to see it. Let's hope.
Yeah, too many gardens would be a high-class problem to have. I will remind Ernie and others that you had that slide, that aerial photo of where next to a restoration project, I think they had used the soil, the sediment for creating soccer fields.
Yes.
Do I have that right? So I think it's looking for opportunities like that, where it just cut the transportation costs as low as possible by using it as locally as possible.
Yes, yes. And once you put the sediment down, you can't leave it exposed. I mean, you have to either seed it or plant trees or something. You can't just leave a large area exposed, or you'll have the same problem again.
Right. Either through rain or wind erosion. Verna asks, can you say what some of the widest breadths of hydric soils have been documented along these drainages?
As I understand it, they're pretty thin, a few inches. The couple slides I had at Big Spring Run in Pennsylvania, the the one that was first restored, that looked to be about 4 to 5 inches. They're not very wide because there was relatively little sediment running off.
Okay. Lars asks, he has a second question here. Where can we find reference valleys with long continuity, free from radical disturbance from logging, etc.? Do they exist? Have they been mapped? So first, I'm going to ask you to explain, if you can, what a reference valley is.
I assume that would be a reference valley would be an unaltered, a totally unaltered. I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of any.
Okay. I want to thank folks like Cynthia and others who've been posting links to old growth forests. So be sure to look for those links there in the Q&A. Sarah Farmer says, you mentioned mycorrhiza in soils. How would inundation for decades affect soil life, including microorganisms and seed banks? I would think those would all be killed by the inundation.
Well, on stream banks, once they're deposited on stream banks, the legacy sediments wouldn't necessarily be inundated. The carbon is likely to disappear. And I have read estimates of the carbon that was lost through the deforestation, but it's such a big number, I couldn't even wrap my head around it. Certainly, a lot of the microorganisms would die. But I'm not a biologist. I really couldn't tell you what would come back in from decay, from leaves and so on, organic material coming down on the legacy sediments. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done. I mentioned the nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, which have relatively complex chemical cycles. A lot of research needs to be done on just how much of a problem they are in legacy sediments. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer. Certainly the loss would be great, but whether it would be recouped over time as organic processes continue, I just couldn't say.
Okay. So Verna followed up. Verna had asked about the width of the hydric soils, not the depth. So I don't know if you have any sense of.
Oh, okay, I see. Like over the acreage of the floodplain.
I guess.
Yes, I've never seen any I've never seen any metrics in the literature on that particular aspect. Dorothy Merritt's would be the good person to ask about that. It would depend, I guess, to some extent on how wide the valley is.
Well, Verna follows up with how wide might these wetlands have been?
Yeah. I have not seen any estimates of that. I'm not sure that they have dug, far from the stream, in other words, to determine that. That would be a good question to ask Dorothy Merritt. I'll ask her, and I can give her email out too.
Okay.
That.
So we're going to end with one more from Lars. He hits the trifecta today. Where can someone find maps of long continuity reference watershed? Are they posted online somewhere?
Long continuity watersheds.
Reference watersheds.
Okay, again, I'm assuming reference means undisturbed watersheds. I think you'd have to go out west for that. I doubt there would be any in the east that you could point to that you could say are undisturbed.
Okay.
So you have to go out west, and I assume there's plenty of watershed maps online. If you dig a little bit, you'll find them. But maybe in the Great Smoky Mountains, there's roughly 100,000 acres of undisturbed forest there that was not logged, stopped at the last minute. Maybe in there you'd find a reference watershed, heavily forested. That would be about it as far as I know.
Okay. So I'll ask one last question. If someone wants to get involved in conservation efforts with this topic in mind, legacy sediments, are there organizations that are working on this sort of thing? I guess it's mitigation. Are there organizations that you can suggest people seek out?
Well, wherever you live, there's likely to be a watershed group. My watershed group is Friends of the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. There's Friends of this and that and the other river. There's Friends of Virginia Rivers, I believe. Just start Googling, look for your local river and look for a friends group. You can start there and just work up. Yes, there are many watershed groups. There are many people who volunteer along streams. Of course, trash pickup is, the obvious one. There's river keepers, Google river keepers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's highly likely to be a watershed group wherever you live.
So yeah, locate your nearest river or major stream.
Yes.
Use that name as the keyword search. Like here in Durham, it's the River Association, right? So it doesn't say friends of, but start with the name of that
Yes.
tributary, that stream, that river, that body of water nearest you, and seek it out. And they're always looking for people to come out and help, as you said, with trash pickup, things like that. They will always welcome donations and financial support. And if you're seeing issues, I would say start contacting your state and federal representatives as well. And as always, get out and vote. And the other thing is, when you're looking for any of Chris's books, please support your local bookstore.
Yes.
Amazon doesn't need any more of your money. Please support your local bookshops. And as a librarian, I know that means even more to you.
Yes.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your presentation today.